This is the London FinTech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman. This is the London FinTech Podcast, episode 220, brought to you in association with Smart and theillistedboard.com, and I'm delighted to be joined once again today by Mario Ineco, aka Maneco64, of the ever-growing YouTube channel entitled The Home of Alternative Economics and Contrarian Views, to discuss central banking per se. As you may have noticed, our social systems are in a mess, our economies are in a mess, our governance is a mess, and our culture is being carpet-bombed. Apart from which I suspect everything's quite fine, and it's certainly a sunny morning today, so the sun comes up regardless. However, we all know the problems. We've been talking about this once or twice. I think less well observed, even in folks that I know who have been in financial services for 40 years, is the connection between monetary collapse and social collapse. One of Mario's attributes is that he has an awesome knowledge and library of books on monetary history and interest in this topic. In this context of the correlation between monetary collapse and social collapse, two that he recommends that I checked out are Fiat Inflation in Revolutionary France by Andrew Dickinson White, where you can get a free PDF online, and the classic When Money Dies by Ferguson about the Weimar Republic. Picking up this connection between perhaps the obscure issues of monetary policy and the less obscure issues of the society we live in, one frame one might have on the present is that the present is in large part the result of 1972, when Nixon, quotes, temporarily, unquotes, suspended the gold standard. Well, how would this be? Or without diving into all the detail, in a fiat currency regime, aka totally bullshit money, as we've covered once or twice, politicians end up spending, and central banks end up printing. This has happened many times throughout history, and the late David Graeber, in his book Debt the First 5,000 Years, covers many examples going back to biblical days. Naturally, politicians spending infinite amounts of money and central banks printing infinite amounts of money totally fucks up the economy. And that's before we get into the ideas of the globalists right now. You know, those folks who are living the Hunger Games dream, flying in private jets and telling ordinary Joe to take the bus, or rather not to take the bus, because it causes climate change. So, what could possibly be done about this? If we ever get through the current insanity and have to rebuild, the key behind all this is, in terms of where we are at the moment, the critical role of central banks in monetary policy. And we can ask a very simple question: are they a good thing? Taking the US as it's a clearer case, the Federal Reserve is a 20th century construct. But even in England, for the vast majority of the past N centuries, there's been no central bank. And if you take a look at chart of N centuries, let's say 1,000 years worth of inflation in England, you'll see that the prima facie evidence the bloated nanny state, in this case in the guise of technocratic central bankers, have to answer is, at a minimum, they've got a lot of explaining to do, because the crazy inflations seem to only actually really happen in periods of having a central banks, apart from one or two other notable exceptions. At a macro level, the 20th century was notable for the hyper-bloating in the West of power in the hands of a centralised few, a state which has ended up as a smothering nanny. Indeed, central banks creating currency is the ultimate in unelected power, with all their decisions inevitably benefiting one group at the expense of another. As we saw in 2008, with the notable exception of Iceland, who bankrupted their banks, not their people, in the US and the UK and the like, central banks bankrupted their people to ensure that banks and bankers continue to have their pockets lined, literally in the case of multi-million bonuses for bankers in London in 2008, 9, 10. So, the challenge is, if you're against limitless printing of paper money to enrich the rich and impoverish the average Joe, what is the opposite, and how would it work? If we all find a free island in the world and go back to draining almost all the power from the centre and the hands of a few, how would money work? What would have happened if Ron Paul had managed to end the Fed? Plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Good morning, Mario. Thank you for joining me on the show today.
Good morning, Mike, and thank you for having me on again.
So, we were just chatting beforehand, and I was saying that I was impressed by a couple of things, one of which is your work rate. You churn out daily YouTube videos, which take some doing. And as a lazy sod who only manages to do one audio podcast every 2 weeks, that's totally beyond my conception. I think I'm allergic to hard work. It's always been a bit of a problem for me. And the second regard was that one of your recent updates was from the pistes in Switzerland, which looked truly beautiful. And having not been skiing for a few years and failed to go skiing 3 years ago when we actually had arrived in France that day when France was shut down, which was unlucky, it seemed a very nice place to be. So whereabouts in Switzerland were you, and how was the snow?
Yeah, we were in the Bernese Oberland, in the Sonnenland it's called, and the snow was great. And where I was skiing was about 1,500 to 2,000 meters, maybe a bit more. And there's a lot of different mountains connected. So you had a lot of options, and it was really cold. So the snow was really good, and I really enjoyed it.
Oh, excellent. Well, as I mentioned once or twice before, the Ballemans are originally from Switzerland, and I rather wished that when my great-grandfather returned to Switzerland, he'd taken my grandparents with him. They'd certainly have a better currency along with the better weather. So rather than excessive chit-chatting beforehand, because we've got quite a big topic here, why don't we just go straight into diving into the main course? And before we get on to this tutorial discussion of central banking, which, like many things in the modern state, is taken for granted by the vast majority, but those people who are actually trying to think outside the box can see that it is one of the fundamental things without the reform of which one's going to struggle to do anything else, including improve the sort of social situation and the massive divisions between the hyper-rich and everyone else. Before we dive into that, a year ago you were on the show and you were one of the first people to talk about, and you've been talking about it for some time, this strange word called de-dollarization, and this was before the Ukraine war broke out, which simply from the perspective of the American dollar currency, they had a catastrophic idea of freezing the Russian central bank reserves, which seemed to have various implications, and other countries around the world noticed that. So we've got de-dollarization, and we've got the whole multipolarity, we've got the BRICS, we've got ideas that the BRICS are going to harden their currencies, and CBDCs, most central banks of the world have been examining them, but it's a dog that hasn't barked yet. So before we dive into the strategic question of central banks per se, maybe you'd like to update us briefly on how the last year has gone and what your outlook is for 2023.
Yeah, I think 2008 was a big wake-up call for the Chinese and other dollar creditors. And at the time, they decided to start investing or adding gold to their reserves because they could see that, the dollar could go anytime like it almost did in '08. So since 2022, in the beginning of the year before we spoke, before the Ukraine war kicked off, I had been talking about de-dollarization, and also in the context of '08, and also in the fact that the U.S. and its allies were using the dollar as a political weapon. So it was normal that China and Russia started looking into options to de-dollarize, to be less dependent on the petrodollar. Like I've spoken about how China has created exchanges in Shanghai, precious metals exchanges, also commodities exchanges, the new payment system in China and also in Russia. So they've all been preparing for this, I think, and they know that a fiat currency like the dollar, which it has been since Nixon closed the gold window in the early 70s, doesn't last forever. And I think what the Ukraine war has done is it's accelerated this process of de-dollarization because there's been a blatant breakage of the rule of law here, international law, by the Americans and the West basically freezing a few $100 billion of Russian reserves. And I think the Chinese, they realized that, well, we could be next, and we've got a lot more reserves than the Russians. And lo and behold, today I saw a headline that China added another 15 metric tons of gold to their reserves, the People's Bank of China, in January. And they announced that they added in November and December. And I think that's a signal to the world, because the Chinese usually take a few years to update their reserves. They do it like, let's say, once, and then they wait 4 years and they do it again. But now they're doing it every month. So yeah, and the BRICS, they're going along with Russia and China, because I think when we in the West look at the news, they say the world is united against Russia and in favor, defending Ukraine. And I'm not taking sides here, but if you look at a world map, you look at the world that's with NATO, it's not many countries. The rest of the world, they're neutral. They're not like saying that they think what Russia is doing and what's happening in Ukraine is right, but they're not taking sides. And I think you mentioned it as well in something you sent me, that even during World War II, the Germans, they kept doing business. They were in the BIS, the German Reichsbank representative, and there was an American representative. He wasn't from the Fed, but I think he was from one of the New York banks. And so the enemies were doing business in the BIS, but now they've completely cut off Russia. And I think it's a wake-up call. And what happened in December 7th, when the president of China went to Saudi Arabia and met the Saudi royal family, Mohammed bin Salman. He also met the other leaders from the Gulf Cooperation Council. Yeah, this is the creation. I think it will be a date that will be remembered. Is the creation of the petro-yuan and the move away from the petrodollar. I don't think the Saudis are going to stop using dollars because they've said so. I think there's an official at Davos who said, we just want to be able to use whatever currency we want. So all that's going to do is going to create less demand for dollars all around the world. And that's going to hurt Americans because historically in the last 50, 60 years, they've been able just to print and borrow and not have to earn foreign reserves to buy anything. And I think we're already starting to see that with the prices rising in the US.
Yes, totally. And it's analogous to the decline of sterling as the world currency back in the day. And as you say, there is a considerable economic value of having the world's currency for a whole bunch of reasons. And my macro take on this is that last year was a catastrophic one with a pretty catastrophic administration for America, even from an American state perspective. And they basically cocked it up and once again totally misunderstood the strength of Russia. So back in the day, about 30 years ago, before the fall of the Iron Curtain in the USSR, I think the CIA were known to have massively overestimated the strength of the Soviet Union, and it was a bit of a surprise the whole bloody thing sort of fell apart because it was a house of cards. These days I think it's massively underestimated. But I think everybody now sees that Americans, whatever they may have done in the past, have overused this whole sanction thing, and in doing so have promoted the multipolar world that perhaps they didn't want. And we'll come on to at the end a little bit about gold, because gold clearly had a role to play in Russia's stabilization, and I think that just from a macroeconomic perspective, it was the ace from up their sleeve that they produced, in the absence of which the American strategy of economically destroying their foes would have succeeded. And in terms of the BRICS and all that, as you say, there's the rapprochement between China and Saudi. I even saw recently some mention on the Duran, a channel that you'd mentioned, and who I found very useful. I don't always agree with their takes, but what they are brilliant at is producing a sort of an HD JPEG of a situation. They give you so much more information, vastly more information, you can draw your own conclusions. However, they were talking about a rapprochement, amazingly enough, between Iran and Saudi. So the tectonic plates geopolitically are changing, and that's very, very relevant to the outlook for money per se. And money is the F in financial services is finance, and that is money. So I really think that it behoves us all to understand. And the CBDCs, maybe we'll just put that one to one side because not one of us thinks it's any good. And at the moment, I'm still waiting for the first central bank who's going to be the first over the top and introduce something and saying that, criticism of the state will mean you can't buy your sweeties at sweet shop when you go there on the way to school. So let's move on from that in a moment, because we will come back to this hardening of currencies, as I called it, where the non-Western alliance, shall we say, are busy doing that. So just moving on then. So many people, and certainly I, when I ran Global Fixed Interest Fund Management, took the central banks as a fact of life, just as I took gravity as a fact of life, and the sun is just how it is. And sure, in the past, there was a gold standard, and but whatever. And I think the likes of the FT are still in that. They call it, barbarous relic or what have you. But before we get on to gold, I think that, as you say, 2008 was a notable time where people started to question it. The Bank of England itself subsequently admitted in its bureaucraty's technocratic language, their approach to the crisis of 2008 did lead to redistributional effects, aka the reverse Robin Hood, robbing from the poor and giving to the rich. So the Bank of England, this is not no conspiracy theory, the Bank of England have admitted to that. And I think that the critiques of central banks really fall into two groups, one of which is that they're not good for the economy. They're actually harmful for the economy, contrary to why they're set up, to be good for the economy. Central banks tend to lead to inflation, they encourage more government spending. The central banks, and going back to Graeber, 5,000 years of debt, they always end up printing too much money. Revolutionary France, Weimar Republic, or now, and fiat money always ends up collapsing, which is, I think we're a long way down that one. So that they're harmful to the economy, and secondly, that they're anti-democratic. You've got a bunch of technocrats, but who controls them is always an interesting question, from rational conversation in academia to the more paranoid people that, Rothschild controls every central bank in the world and he's sort of sitting there, or WEF controls or something like that. And the answer is that none of us know, which in itself shows a democratic deficit. In itself, the lack of transparency is a thing. So anyway, how do you see these two huge areas in terms of the argument against the central banks being that, well, actually, if you forget theory, we look at practice. How's the last century gone? Have they been good for the economy or have they been harmful? And also then just more philosophically, are they democratic?
Yeah, like you, when I started out in the finance business in the late 80s, I didn't even question central banks. I didn't even know much about them. It was only later that I started questioning things, because that's my nature. But in terms of the last century, I would say central banking has allowed the world to be in an endless war. Even though we think that World War I and World War II ended already. But look at after World War II, we had the Cold War. We had regional wars. And then after the Cold War ended, with the fall of the Soviet Union, we went right back to war in the Middle East against Iraq, the first Iraq war. And from what I hear, the Americans gave Saddam Hussein the nod to invade Kuwait, because the Kuwaitis were drilling for oil sideways into Iraqi territory, and then they backstabbed them, of course. So that was probably a build-up to the new war in the Middle East, and then the war on terror. And now we have, I don't know, it's the war on whatever you want to pick. We had the war on COVID, now we have the war on Russia. We could have the war on China. And the thing is, if you look back, for example, even when we had central banks in the late 1700s, early 1800s, yes, there was a period where we went off gold. The Bank of England, I think it was called the restriction period, from 1797 to 1821. That was to allow the country to fight the Napoleonic Wars. So they suspended convertibility. But once that ended, they went back, you see. But now we went away from sound money, for example, gold standard in 1914, and we've never gone back, and we stayed in this inflationary big government as well. And people could argue, though, the 20th century and 21st century, we've seen so many advances in technology. The average person lives so much better off than the late Victorians or early Edwardian period. But the other argument is, how do you know that we couldn't be doing even better if we had sound money, small government, no wars, peace? I think that's the whole problem with central banking. It allows for these crises, and these crises are what the central banks and the government, because central banks are a monopoly created by the government. And it allows powerful people to sometimes even instigate these crises to give an excuse to indebt people, the nations even more. And I think that's the definition of the last 100 years for me. And that's why we are where we are right now. The general public is poor. I saw the other day in the UK, the bottom 10%, the medium wage of the bottom 10% of the UK is lower than in Slovakia. I mean, this is a century of that's what the central banks have done. And you could even argue that central banks might be able to create prosperity, but there's always a crisis that they use as an excuse to basically rip off the public at the expense of those at the top. And war, of course, is a very profitable business. It's the most profitable business, really. So that's how I see the last 110 years or so. And central banking, we wouldn't have been able to do it without central banking.
Yes, indeed. Well, there's a lot in what you say, and of course I agree with you. I think the major thing that you've done there is that in terms of my two areas of critique, harmful to the economy and anti-democratic, I think you've picked up very well the dog that didn't bark, or the implicit dog in there, which is that monetary systems have always been heavily related to militarism. And as you know, David Graeber points out that although the general economics professions say that, money evolved from barter, there is no anthropological evidence anywhere that that is actually the case. And there is a lot of evidence that actually where money evolved from was that your army would be somewhere else. And it would need to, either it just stole all this stuff, which some armies did, of course. You steal everybody's food and you murder and rape them and stuff like that. Where there's been lots of that in the last few thousand years, sad to say. Or you actually, give them a bit of silver or something for their crops, or for a beef sandwich or whatever you might have when you're going off to war. So money has intimately been related to militarism. And so I do think, yes, it's one of the critiques of a central state, really, not just central banks. I mean, if we look at the 16th century, Henry VIII's dissolution, the monasteries, which were vast, they were the richest organisation in the country at the time. And he dissolved them, nicked all their money so he could go and fight France more. So one of the real concerns for those of us going forward who are anti any war whatsoever, which is definitely me, I'm a hippie at heart, even if I don't have the hair for it. Going back to 1972 and the Vietnam War and all that kind of stuff, I was very much against that kind of thing. Is that money and fiat money and the state needing more money almost inevitably comes back to war. And that I think that a great benefit, let's say we can wave a magic wand and, you and I are transported 10 years hence when all this globalism and insanity the old order has just died and collapsed in a heap. And we are on some island. Peter Thiel is president for life, and it's sort of, it's a libertarian kind of thing. And the state has some laws, 10 commandments, that'll probably be fine, or the Buddhist version, it doesn't really matter. You have sort of a list of 10 or 8 things, and everything else is just what people are allowed to do with each other. Then I think that a sound money scheme would mean that this island, even if it wanted to, couldn't go off and kill people abroad, which is, I'm afraid to say, what militarism has really involved, whether it's been the UK or the US for the past centuries, or your ancestors back in Portugal. So, yes, I think the war is an important one. I think just to try and sort of ping-pong some of these things back. So both you and I, and this is my fault, not yours, have used the word central banks kind of loosely in two senses. One of which is there is a central bank. I mean, the Bank of England was created in, whatever it was, 1698 or something like that, but it didn't have the rules then that it does have now. So there is a role in a central bank in printing, shall we say, good currency. I'll say more about that in a second. And then there's where we are at the moment, which is the central bank in printing fiat money and all that kind of thing. So we have central banks with, let's call it sound money, with silver money or gold money, and helping the government just manage its sort of cash flow and accounts and that kind of role, where I think you need something. And one example of, I think, the earliest type of central banking, we were talking before about ChatGPT, and you'd had challenges at getting something sort of revolutionary out of it, and I'd been a bit more successful. And I think a lot of using ChatGPT as a research tool comes into using the kind of prompts. But one of the interesting things I got out of it was about monetary policy in Anglo-Saxon England. So if you go back to hard currencies and no central banks, and it's exactly as happened in the late Roman Empire, what happens is the people producing the coins just shave them a little bit. Every day they stick another 1% of the silver in their own pocket and say, here's a coin, here's a shilling, and the shilling goes back to Anglo-Saxon times. Here's a shilling. And so every now and then, the various kings of England, before we had one king, did eventually have to step in and go, hang on, no. I'm going to produce the money, it's going to have my head on it, and it will have this much silver in, silver shillings going back a long, long time. So just on that point, maybe we should drill in a little bit more into central banks in terms of central banks and current monetary policy, fiat inflation, and central banks as just managing the government's cash flow, a department in the government, as well as making sure that the coins are made of silver and aren't made of 90% silver and 10% tin.
Yeah, I think the Bank of England's, founded in 1694. And at the time, I think they had the monarch or the crown had £2 million in debt. And that was a way to consolidate the debt. And what the Bank of England creation did was allow for for the government now to create a national debt. And yes, this currency was a lot sounder back then, but don't forget, I think it was James Patterson, one of the founders of the Bank of England. He actually said that we have the privilege to be able to earn interest on money created out of thin air. So the fractional reserve was already existent, and despite the fact that the money was sounder, I think it was the first step into basically lumbering the debt of the monarch to the people, because prior to the Bank of England, if a king or a queen wanted to go to war, they were responsible for those debts, not the public. And I think that's the key about the Bank of England, is that it melded the national debt to the public, and it made it all very, technical. And I'm going to recommend a book by William Cobbett. He was actually an MP in the 1830s, and he wrote a book called Paper Against... Well, it's not a book. It's a series of letters, because he was imprisoned once for basically defaming King George III. Said he defamed him, and so he put him in prison for a couple of years. And he wrote letters to his followers, and it's Paper Against Gold, containing the history and mystery of the Bank of England, the funds, the debt, the lowering and raising of the value of paper money. So he basically talks about that with the creation of the Bank of England, it made fighting wars and increasing the power of the state much easier. And the people, of course, who were involved were the bankers, the very wealthy families in the realm, and they were the major shareholders. And there's a critic of the Bank of England, a guy called A.H.M. Ramsay. He was an MP during World War II who was imprisoned actually by Churchill. And he wrote about the Bank of England, how if you look at a farmer has £100 worth of land and he gets a yield of 4% a year. He has to work hard, get up every morning. But a banker, he will have £100, he will lend it out 10 times and get 4%, but that really means 40%. So he said, can you imagine what will happen to England after hundreds of years of this scheme where the bankers can create value out of thin air and earn interest on it, and then the farmers and the average person. And I think that's where we are. That criticism was right. 300 plus years of central banking has not really done much to the general public's prosperity, I would say. And the 1% now is even smaller. It's like 0.1%. So yeah, money was sounder when the Bank of England was founded, as I think it was by royal assent. But it wasn't totally sound, I would say, because they had this power of fractional reserve. And the other thing as well, they always used the crises, as I said, as an excuse for emergencies. So that's how I see it.
Yes, it's an interesting overview of the progression of it and the extent to which, if you create an organisation in the state, it doesn't empower the people, but it makes it easier for the state to do what it wants. Because, as you say before, kings would go off to war and they'd have to sort of get someone to pay for it. So they'd just send the boys around to go and sort of, knock on doors and all that kind of stuff, or there's the barons, and then the barons would, steal from below. And I think this problem of centralised power is the fundamental issue, and one of the problems here is that central banks concentrate a certain type of power in apparently neutral technocratic fashion, but it's not. And I say power is the real thing, because one of the things, just looking at my little researches this morning, was a rather sort of horrendous thing, actually. You may have come across the expression pay through the nose, but I don't know whether you know where it comes from, and I certainly didn't know where it comes from. Pay through the nose comes back to the days when the Vikings were marauding around these islands, and the Vikings would turn up and they say, we want a few shillings of yours, thank you very much. And if you didn't have them, they would slit your nose from lip to eyebrow, which was called paying through the nose. And we have this sort of phrase now, but we've forgotten how gruesome it was. And we were on a separate example, we were in Lewis recently, and there was a plaque about Simon de Montfort, I think in the 13th century. And he'd led a bunch of barons against the king, because the king, aka the state, in those days, the king was spending way too much and the taxes are too high and all this kind of stuff. So the general problem will always arise with or without central banks, that if you've got some centralised power, they will use that power to bully everyone else, but it's just an agency for multiplying it. And back to your point about the kind of Ponzi scheme that this MP was talking about, growing and growing and growing. As David Graeber points out, every example of a fiat system we've ever had has ended up in collapse, which is why back in the Bible you've got the debt jubilee, you have to wipe all the debt out and start again, and these kind of matters. So yes, so I think the innocent listener, even if they may detect that you and I come from a rather similar position, will hopefully get the idea that there are some serious critiques that central banks have to answer. I think in terms of coming from one position or another, it's a bit like my Gedanken about America. Look, why doesn't America just split into two? And one bit can do all its sort of, wokey, whatevery stuff, and the other bit can go back to being sort of following the Constitution much more closely than it is, and not fighting abroad and making Ron Paul president or something. And we'll run this little experiment and see how the two halves do. But moving on to a world in which you and I are given the role, talking about fantasies. We have a crazy dream tonight. We have too much red wine and too much cheese before bed, and we have a dream. And in the dream, we've got to design the new world. What is the opposite? So if you are against injections, the opposite is clear. If you're against masks, the opposite is clear. If you're against the idea that America is spreading peace throughout the world, in Syria, in Libya, and Iraq, and in Ukraine, if you're against that idea, the opposite is very clear. In terms of the opposite to central banks, I think one of the problems of the very small opposition to central banks, in terms of those people who focus and know about it, is the tendency of all, let's say, revolutionary movements to fragment, as lampooned by Monty Python, The Life of Brian. You've got the Judea Popular Front, and you've got the Popular Judea Front, and they all hate each other and all this kind of thing. So if you dive into it, you've got Rothbard's view, and he's not quite the same as Ron Paul's, and you've got Lew Rockwell, and you've got the Mises, and you've got all these people who end up sort of squabbling over the little detail. But in a sense, the little detail, A, doesn't really matter compared to the big picture, and B, in this world of samsara, in this world of duality, human beings are always going to argue over stuff. So let us start with the big picture. The opposite, I assume, from what you say, is that we go back to some kind of gold standards. How you get there is unclear, because the people in power are never going to vote to have their power reduced. But let's say somehow we wave a magic wand. Is there anything in this human realm that is perfect? If we wave a magic wand and we get Mario's head of the Bank of England and he abolishes it and he says we've all got gold coins now and all that, will you just sort of sit there and have to smoke a cigar for the next few decades of your reign, or will there always be issues to deal with?
Well, I think the solution or the opposite of central banking is competition. I'm not against banks, because some people will accumulate more money than others and they'll have to safeguard it. They might not want to keep it at home. And that's what the function of a bank used to be. Or you might want to lend that money, so the banker will become a money lender as well. So I think it's very simple. You could even let the Bank of England survive, but let it survive as just any other bank and not backed by the government, no monopoly. And you also abolish legal tender laws, because legal tender laws force the public to use the fiat currency, because if they didn't have the legal tender laws, why would you accept a piece of paper as payment? Piece of paper is worth nothing unless it has legal tender laws backing it and also forcing you to pay your taxes in that legal tender. So I think it's very relatively simple, and I think Ron Paul has spoken about that. You abolish the Bank of England, or tell the Bank of England you no longer have a monopoly. You're going to have to compete for your deposits, and you abolish legal tender law. As to what people want to use as money, I don't think that's for me to decide. I think that's for the market to decide. And historically, they've used anything from conchas to cigarettes. But I think gold and silver have been traditionally, in the last 2,500 years, what people have gone to. It could be something different. Something new could come up to compete with gold and silver, cryptocurrency. So I don't see myself as becoming governor of the Bank of England and smoking my cohiba and telling people what to do. I see maybe the Bank of England becoming just like any other bank, and competition, because that's what the free market is, competition. And some people will argue, well, and then you could have banks that abuse that power, and they will have bank runs and people will lose their money. But we've been having that for the last 20 years anyway, and central banking hasn't really helped. The Federal Reserve was created to provide an elastic currency and a sound currency, and look at how the dollar's done since it was created. So I don't think it's a good argument. So yeah, I see that, free market and money. And then the other argument could be, well, like you said, people used to mint their coins and then they were no good. They cheated. And then the king or the queen came and said, I will make sure that the coins are good. We have our own mints. I mean, I wouldn't even be against that, the government providing that service. But then you have to have a government or a state that is trustworthy. I mean, right now, I wouldn't trust anything to do with government. So that's the other problem. But again, it's like when you buy a car. If they produce a really bad car, whatever company, and people die from it, the brakes don't work or something, people are going to stop buying those cars. It's going to be the same thing with money, I think. That's how I see it.
Yes, it's interesting. So there's a lot in what you say, and I think you get my vote for the Governor of the Bank of England, Mario, if we're in this parallel universe that we suddenly go into, there was an election process for it, and it was that way back in the past. And I've mentioned on the podcast before that in the early 17th century, I mean, the poor East India Company, I feel sorry for them, and probably only a person in this country who does, but they had many crises. They were physically attacked many times, and they were in Philpot Lane. And one of the reasons they were attacked, and actually the economists in the East India Company in the early 17th century created the concept of a balance of payments, because they were destroying the country's balance of payments in terms of store of precious wealth. Because when they went originally over to Spice Islands, India, East Indies basically, they would take woolly jumpers and stuff, which is the kind of thing we made over here. And funny enough, people didn't need woolly jumpers in the Spice Islands. They said, we're not having bloody woolly jumpers. Well, what do you like? Oh, we like silver stuff. So the money markets that you were working in grew up in the 17th century precisely because the East India Company needed to get Spanish thalers, the Spanish dollars, silver currency, because people would use that elsewhere. So it used to be the way that, and this is at the great age of exploration and expansion of England from being some irrelevant little rainy island, which it was, we're going back to that, I think we're there already, was when there wasn't a system of currencies. And you're talking about the Bank of England. I think it only got its sort of semi-full powers in 1844 with the Banking Act then. But the important point, and I make this point about limited liability in the company, which is something else that everyone just takes for granted and next to nobody knows about. That's an even harder cause to push that one, that I've written quite a bit about, is that before central banks, the entire Industrial Revolution happened. If I had to say one unique thing about this country, is that it had 1,000 years, comparatively compared to other countries, of pushing individual liberty and letting people do their own thing. And as we saw in the early America, a case saddened by the destruction of the Native Americans, but let's put that to one side. If you let people do their own thing within an appropriate framework of laws, so they just don't go around massacring people like the Mongols, then it is creativity and people will solve it. And as you say, then in the case of the cryptocurrencies, I have a problem with the cryptocurrencies in that they're not really real. But I can see that if you're a tech person, you say, well, money isn't real. It's a bunch of bits in a computer. And I've got a better bits in the computer. And I think I want to use that and my mates want to use it. Well, fine. There's no reason to stop them. But the transitional issues you referred to are not inconsiderable, which I think is why one finds that one gets a collapse like the Weimar Republic, like the French Revolution, that has to have somebody coming in and changing it, because there's no point putting it to a vote because everyone will disagree. And one of the problems you've got at the moment is after a century of the nanny state, or certainly post-Second World War, as I said in the New York podcast, Hayek was correct, we're completely down the road to serfdom already. If you've got a state who believes, even in the heart of hearts, even if they're being nice, their job is to protect people, well, they end up smothering them and they end up with a crap education system. And I was recently looking at Thomas Sowell's Dismantling America, and it reminded me quite a lot of Peter Hitchens, that the way the US and the UK have been undone is by an appalling education system, collapse compared to what it was 50 years ago, especially for the poor. I mean, in this country, as Hitchens points out, the statistics show that grammar schools, for example, were the main ladder out of being stuck in the working class, stuck in this 10% who are poorer off than if they were in Slovakia. So yes, there's a big transitional issue there, but that's not one for us to discuss. I mean, the world is going to do what the world is doing, but maybe it is a good point to touch on at that point. In particular, Andrew Dixon White's Fiat Inflation in Monetary France, in that My understanding of having read about the first half, I think I have to admit, Mario, I ground to a halt before the end. There's a lot of information in there. It takes someone like you to understand it all. But basically, and this is a sort of an economic expression used in markets, and other people might think it's a bit rude, but it's a very technical word. The economy was fucked when Napoleon came in. The currency was fucked. It was all a disaster. That sounds rude in English, but actually amongst traders and ex-fund managers, there's a very technical meaning of that. But Napoleon came in and he instituted a gold standard, and that was how he stabilised the economy. Now, going back to gold standards don't stop war, Napoleon, which is the bit I don't like him for going around Europe killing millions of people, but some people like Napoleon.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing he said is that I will pay everything in cash, which at the time was gold and silver. And that's how he put the country back on a gold standard or a sound money footing. Napoleon, of course, came in and stabilized things, but it was at great expense, like you said. Yeah, millions of people died, not just French people, but people from all over Europe, and it created havoc. So, and like you said before, the reason it happened in France was because the economy was fucked. And why is that? Well, because the previous King Louis XVI and his predecessors, they spent too much money. They fought the Indian Wars. They were in debt. And it's very similar to what's happening today. We have insurmountable national debts in the US, in the UK, in Europe, and we have even the consumer has a lot of that, corporate debt. And so our economies are also effed, I would say, despite the fact that we've been told by Janet Yellen that everything's great. I think they patch things up nowadays in the economy through government deficit spending. You look at the US government, the budget deficit there is still more than 5% of GDP. So if they weren't spending all that money, the economy would certainly be in a recession. But what comes after it? I mean, it will be a period of great tribulation, if you want to call it that, chaos. And we could get another Napoleon, or like in Weimar, Germany, we got, what we got in the 30s and 40s. Looking back, it's not encouraging. But that's why we do what we're doing here through your podcast, through my videos, to try to get the public to learn about these things, because most people, and even people in the city, like you said, when I started out, I didn't know that money was so important. Also, the soundness of the money was so important, because we just didn't think of what money was. We just went in, we tried to write as many tickets as possible and make a big bonus at the end of the quarter. But we never thought, what is it all about? And hopefully, if we try to enlighten people to what it's all about, and I'm not saying we're going to have utopia, but hopefully we'll have a better system. But it's not guaranteed that it will be a smooth sailing through this period. It's probably going to be like going, around Cape Horn, and not through like Admiral Sea. That's a saying in Brazil. When if you want to go sailing, you never want too much wind. You want everything to be smooth. It's not going to be smooth, but at least I think hopefully, free market, sound money will be something that will be still an idea. And I think that's what we need to keep doing, keep it alive. Because without it, I don't think we can have the free Western civilization that you talked about, where people are free, individuals are free. That we're not doing something for the collective, because I think that's a problem. And I'm not being selfish. I'm just saying if you respect each other and you try to do the best for yourself, I think the world would be in a lot better place, because then you wouldn't have politicians trying to take things from Paul to give to Peter. That's where all the problems begin, I think.
Yes, and just to sort of wrap up on this point about the transition, I think the final question I'll put to you, Mario, will be this question of, just briefly, the use of gold, particularly by China, you mentioned, but also Russia in terms of gold flooring their ruble, and all of this talk you get on shows like yours about potential move to sort of gold standard or semi-gold standard in some of these countries. But before that, as I said earlier in the year, what people think of as conventional wisdom. Maybe when I was young, maybe when you were young, it was roughly right on most things, but not completely right. But these days, conventional wisdom is something that's bought and paid for. And so conventional wisdom in the uni party and in the uni media on gold is it's talk about Keynes is a barbarous relic, and the FT is always writing about that. I mean, just in passing on Keynes, I was very much taken recently by YouTube. I watched by American professor James Crotty, who's written a book called Keynes Against Capitalism, his economic case for liberal socialism. And, as a quote from this book I've got here actually, is that he says that Keynes is misunderstood, and I think he died in about 1946. So this was a very long time ago. It's about a century ago. This chap was living in a very different world, trying to preserve order, and they saw it that you preserve order by having a bigger state. Well, as Hayek was forecast in a Cassandra-like fashion, that ain't going to work well, and it hasn't. But Crotty said that Keynes was not trying to save capitalism as the conventional wisdom would have it, but to replace Britain's capitalist economy with a planned or state-guided socialist economic system built around public and semi-public control of the lion's share of large-scale capital investment. The state was to use its control over capital investment, augmented by capital controls, and the main policy tool to achieve and sustain full employment. So after the Depression, they were very concerned, understandably, because nobody had a bloody job, and that was a disaster. So what do we do? Oh, well, nanny state knows best was the hypothesis at the time. We've tested that one to destruction, and just against the conventional wisdom when it comes to gold and things. And I think I've been very persuaded by you and other channels a year ago, and I put some. You probably won't like how I did it mostly because I put it via ETFs and stuff, but I've tried to reduce the basis risk. Gold and silver in my SIP, which has done better than the rest of the SIP, I think, over the last 12 months. It's quite hard to put the physical stuff into SIPs, different thing entirely. But just in case the listeners don't know, before I ask you about gold and Russia and China to wrap up, that there's a well-known chairman of the Fed called Alan Greenspan who did a huge volte-face, and I got a wonderful quote of his from 1967, long before he decided to sort of sell his soul to the devil, put his face on Time magazine. In 1967, Alan Greenspan wrote, "An almost hysterical antagonism toward the gold standard is one issue which unites statists of all persuasions. They seem to sense perhaps more clearly and subtly than many consistent defenders of laissez-faire that gold and economic freedom are inseparable, that the gold standard is an instrument of laissez-faire, and that each implies and requires the other." And so that was a chap who became chairman of the Fed. Apparently, in his later years, when he was in his 90s and sort of was forgetting to censor himself, as one does when one gets older, perhaps, he started mumbling again about, of course, the gold standard. But anyway, so we've got our problems in the West. It is what it is. You can't, in metaphorical terms, keep kicking the can down the road. Completely ruining my metaphor. Every time you kick the can down the road, another half a dozen appear, so you end up with too many cans that you can kick them all at one time. But just very briefly, just to wrap up, in terms of all these rumours about China's going into a gold standard or a semi-gold standard or a commodity standard, where do you think we are roughly? What sort of Mario's crystal ball say about 2023 and quotes, as I call it, hardening of the BRICS and their currencies?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that Russia and China going to a gold standard doesn't mean that they're going to become less authoritarian or not more democratic. I think they're doing it to become more sovereign from the United States and the West, because in the end of the day, there's an old saying, he who has the gold makes the rules. So I think that's why they're doing that. And I think 2023, we're going to continue to see an acceleration of the move towards these countries accumulating gold. I think in last year, 2022, the most gold was bought by sovereign countries since 1967. And we just saw, just came out now that China is continuing to buy in January. So I think we're going to be moving quicker into that kind of scenario. And I think they can only really use gold as the major reserve asset for, I wouldn't even maybe call it a BRICS currency, but it will be like a Bretton Woods of the East, where there will be a few dominant currencies, but other countries will have to settle their trade with gold. You know, if China has a surplus with Indonesia, the Indonesians will have to ship some gold at the end of the year, and vice versa in the other countries. That's how I see it. Whether it will be ready in 2023, it's difficult to say, but I think we're quickly moving towards that.
Right, good. So that's been a nice tour d'horizon. So before we wrap up the show, I'd like to thank all the listeners out there. My brand partner for the podcast, Smart, is transforming pensions and retirement worldwide. Their leading-edge retirement tech platform propelled them to success in the UK. Now they're operating on 4 continents and working with partners like Zurich and JP Morgan. Find out more at www.smart.co. The enlistedboard.com, your guide to entrepreneurial governance and how you can start making your board an engine of growth today. So, Mario, maybe you'd like to do some shout-outs for your channel or sponsors or anything like that, as you've been very kind in donating your time and expertise to summarising for the listeners. It's certainly been a great pleasure for me to have a macro conversation with you, as, of course, if you're producing daily content, it's always sort of the news, and it's quite nice to zoom up to the big picture, which you do occasionally yourself, and in interviews with some sort of very interesting people as well.
Yeah, my content is published every day, as you said, on Maneko64. That's my YouTube channel, so you can find daily videos there. I do a live stream on Sunday. And as for partners, well, I have a few precious metals dealer that I partner with. One in London is called Gold Investments. They've been in business for over 40 years. They're a family-run business. You can give them my promo code is Maneko64. And for my North American viewers, I've partnered recently with ITM Trading. You can find their stuff if you Google ITM Trading. They will help you, especially if you are a novice in precious metals. Yeah, so there you go. Thank you for your invitation, Mike.
Excellent. Well, anybody that didn't get those can look in the show notes of any of Maneko's videos and click on a link rather than Googling them. And I guess like everyone else, Mario, the interesting thing about FS actually is you go to bed and you wake up in the morning and the world has changed slightly the next day. So we all keep going to bed and waking up in the morning and seeing how it's changing. But again, going back to Graeber's book, some of the big picture themes are very common. The world we're in is financially, in terms of what money is, unsustainable, and we shall see what happens going forward. So thank you very much for that, and congratulations on all your hard work, and keep it up for all of our benefit.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you're in need of a non-executive or advisory director with deep expertise, experience and contacts in the worlds of both traditional FS and fintech, or unique insight into how to make your board an engine of growth today, contact me at mike@mikeballiman.com. If you just need one-off advice in these areas, via clarity.fm/mikeballiman.
We could sit in a bend there all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moonrise, watching a happy moonrise. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. The city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 Watch the firelight dance.